this is not an easy subject to talk through. It has to do with Paul Nevin resigning. I know that maybe some people might pull me up on that and say, oh, he didn't resign, he left by mutual consent. But whatever you want to call it, leaving, departing, resigning. He wasn't sacked, we know that, right? But he left. He decided to leave. If Paul Nevin had wanted to stay, he'd still be here. It wasn't the club decided he should go. So I'm going with resignation, right? It makes you think about other things, and it makes you think about David Moyes' future, because this ain't a good look. And I know it's been covered, and it is yesterday's news, but having had a long think about it, I think now is possibly the perfect time for David Moyes to leave and depart. And I know I may contradict what I've said, even as recently as a month ago, but as I always say, when you're presented with new evidence, maybe it's time to change your mind. And it's pretty heavy new evidence. I thought it was really important that David Moyes was allowed the opportunity to continue at West Ham in the final year of his contract as reward for lifting a European trophy. It seemed fair. It seemed like the right thing to do. I think the fact that he's lost two of his coaches who have chosen to walk out since then changes the landscape. It was a little bit disturbing when Mark Warburton did it. Because I think, if just dismiss for a second whether you think, just dismiss what you think, your own personal opinion about David Moyes' tactics, and just try and look at this as a friend, right? There's one thing we know, because we got this from Mark Warburton's lips himself. He said the words. He was a friend of David Moyes. They played golf together. They holidayed at the same destination. And David Moyes asked Warburton to come into West Ham and help him as a friend and a coach. So this is his friend. And sometimes you just got to put yourself in that situation. Put myself in that situation. I'm at work and I've asked one of my friends to come and help me out at work. I'm going to give you a job. I think that's a good thing to do, right? Your friends are going to be loyal. Your friends are going to be on your side. I think if you fast forward 12 months, one of your friends walking out and stating publicly that he's walked out because he didn't want to destroy the friendship is a hell of a thing to do. Again, forget his Moyes and Warburton. Think about it yourself. That must have really taken something for Warburton to do that. And now Nevin has done it as well, albeit without the whole friend and holiday narrative. I think by any metric, West Ham, or should we say David Moyes, is hemorrhaging coaches. Goes back to Alan Irvine. Although Alan Irvine did have the whole friend thing going on as well. Alan Irvine was David Moyes' friend. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that Alan Irvine left because he felt he was going to stop being friends with David Moyes. He said he left for family reasons. I always say, look, once is a shame, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a trend. It's now happened 4 times. You've got Stuart Pearce as well. You could argue that it's happened 5 times. It would be a tenuous argument, but I'll give you the argument anyway. That's Steve Round. Steve Round has worked under David Moyes before. Steve Round was meant to go back and work with David Moyes again. Instead, Round went and decided to go and work with Mikel Arteta. Now, it's easy to say now that was... why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you go and work for Arsenal? Why wouldn't you go and work for Arteta? But you've got to remember, the Mikel Arteta now and the Arsenal now are very different from the Mikel Arteta and the Arsenal when he first took the job. It was an inexperienced manager. He was just a coach at Manchester City. He didn't go in there and do particularly well. There was a lot of infighting. If you remember Mesut Ozil and Aubameyang, and there was a lot of stuff. You would suggest that it was at that point, it was far more likely that David Moyes was going to stay in his position longer than Arteta was going to stay at Arsenal. Now, that might look ridiculous now, but back at the time, the landscape wasn't like that. You also got to put into context that this is somebody who had already been working under David Moyes, yet he still chose not to. And I only use that as one standalone example. It's not good enough. If you add Steve Round to Stuart Pearce, you add it to Alan Irvine, you add it to Mark Warburton, now you add it to Paul Nevin, he's got a problem retaining coaches. Which leaves us in a situation we're in now where it almost feels like David Moyes is the last man standing. I understand he's not. I understand Kevin Nolan's there and so on and so forth. And Billy McKinley's still there. But last season, David Moyes spoke about being lonely at West Ham. His words, not mine, lonely. My words were, and I said this after the Brighton game, David Moyes had the look of an isolated man. He looked isolated. The fans were singing. I say the fans. I was in the crowd. I'm not separating myself from it. I mean, you know, he was getting jeered. It was terrible against Brighton. And he stood there and he walked towards the fans and he fronted up to the fans. He didn't. I did a little snarl then. He didn't snarl, but he did front up to the fans. And I said at that point, I did the video that day, and I said he looked like an isolated man. He really did. I think that was the same one where I think Antonio had a bit of a hissy fit, if I'm right. I think that might have been the game when Kevin Nolan threw his iPad down on the ground, which isn't great. Well, could have been worse. Could have been my iPad. But anyway, he looked an isolated man, and he looks even more so now. Mark Warburton and I think Kevin Nolan, they've both said in recent times that nobody had a particular role as a coach at West Ham. That's what they've said. All I would suggest is look at the evidence of your own eyes. Think back to any game last season, and I'm going to describe something now, and when I say it, you'll think, yeah, okay, that's what happens. If West Ham are going to make a substitution, Kevin Nolan stands there with his iPad. I guess he's got a new one, not the broken one. He stands there with his iPad and talks to the player. And he shows them, whatever, we don't know what they're showing him on the screen. Presumably what position he's going to take, whatever. Weaknesses of his opposite number, whatever it is. It's Kevin Nolan's job to brief the substitute that's going onto the pitch. Are we agreed on that, right? That's what happens, yeah? There's something else that happens that you'll recognise. When David Moyes is stood there on the side of the pitch like this, and then he wants counsel. He wants some counsel from one of his lieutenants. It's Paul Nevin that he speaks to. Now you can picture it. You picture them standing together on the touchline. It's Nevin, and 90% of the time it's Nevin. So whilst there might not be an assistant manager, or nobody has got possibly clearly defined roles, it is quite clear who David Moyes is leading on during a game, and it's Paul Nevin. Now we also understand that Mark Warburton was frustrated with David Moyes' tactics. So bearing in mind, we're not a fly on the wall and we don't know, and a lot of this is supposition, all we can do is really second guess. Use the bits of information that we've got. We ain't got a full jigsaw, but we use the pieces that we've got to try and get a view of the bigger picture. And so many have left. I don't think it's easy to work for David Moyes. And I know there'll be a number of you saying, well, no shit, Sherlock. But I think there comes a point where you almost have to sever ties with that, because we've got a decision to make here. And when I say the last man standing, the club is under change at the moment. The board has changed. The future of the club in terms of ownership is changed for a number of reasons, all of which we've discussed here before. There is a new director of football. We now have a sporting director. The previous head of recruitment, Rob Newman, has just had his role diluted. He's now just a scout. You know, maybe the name remains, but it ain't his job anymore. Steeden's doing that. Stuyton. It's Stuyton. Sorry, I've got to get that. Stuyton. I'll get there. His role is to do that. Also, Stuyton's remit, and he's mandated not only to bring in new players, but football operations. That means bringing in coaches. So here's your scenario. Here's a scenario that I've got, and I don't think it's particularly healthy, and I don't think it's very good for David Moyes. And that is that you would suggest, under the remit, as we understand it, that Tim Stuyton is going to be charged with bringing the new coaches in. Well, that's not very good for David Moyes. So what even if we say, let's not let him do it, let David Moyes do it? I would suggest, and I would argue, that David Moyes is not very good at doing it because he can't get them to stay around. Well, maybe that's not a problem, but if you were a coach, would you want to go and work for David Moyes? I'd say no for two reasons. Number one, because it looks like he does hemorrhage coaches. Number two, because there's a lot of relatively negative stories, be they official, that have been confirmed by people I've already discussed about in this video, or whispered stories, let's put it that way. I think number 3 is David Moyes only got a year left on his contract. I think if I was a coach looking in there, I'd be thinking, do I want to go in there for a year? Maybe some people do. Hey, look, there's a lot of coaches are out of work. A year's worth of work at a Premier League club is probably good work if you haven't got any. Don't get me wrong. And then we go back to David Moyes himself. Should David Moyes be doing it? And I just don't think he should. I think there's an opportunity for change now. And the opportunity for change has presented itself because everything has changed. And it almost seems like David Moyes, there's like a broom has gone through, they're sweeping out the old, and David Moyes is sort of stood there. And I go back to what I said after the Europa Conference League final, I hate the name. I go back to what I said about that afterwards. David Moyes deserves to see out the remainder of his contract. Here's what's changed since then. Mark Warburton's left. He doesn't want to fall out with David Moyes. He disagrees with his tactics. That's a big thing on its own. Paul Nevin's left. He hasn't said why, but he's decided to go. I call it a resignation. I think that's fair. And we've got a new director of football. Those 3 things, director of football, 2 coaches leaving. That changes the story. That changes it. Do I still think he deserves to see out the last year of his contract? He does deserve it. He won a trophy. Do I think he should? I think it's a no. And I think there's an opportunity there to rebuild. And I think you either do staggered change over a 12-month period. And I understand that might mean a bit of upheaval for the club. The upheaval's there anyway. There's instability right now. By retaining David Moyes, that doesn't give us stability. We still have instability. There's a new director of football coming in. 2 coaches have left. I would suggest deal with the instability now. Get in somebody new. Thank David Moyes. Pay him off. And I understand what will be said. West Ham won't be able to afford the payoff. But this always gets said, look, David Moyes will not have to be paid off for the full amount of his contract. David Moyes would carry on being paid monthly. And they would come to a settlement figure. And if David Moyes took work on within the next 12 months, then West Ham would stop paying him the moment he took on the new work, or we'd pay up the difference. We don't just have, if he's on £5 million a year, we don't just hand him £5 million tomorrow. So the argument for not dismissing him for monetary reasons isn't really there. But I do think if we're going to do it, it's probably wise to do it now. We're at the start of a transfer window, and West Ham are terrible at this stuff in terms of timing. They're getting it wrong. To drag it out would only hurt West Ham, and I think it'll only hurt David Moyes.